Hey everyone, welcome to our webinar today, Mastering 2025 Marketing Budgets. My name is Amanda Brief. I'm the Senior Event Marketing Manager here at Right Side Up, and I'm so excited to kick off today's webinar, especially with it being so timely with 2025 just around the corner. And before we get started, just wanted to familiarize everyone on this call with Right Side Up. If you don't know who we are a collective of marketing specialists who have helped more than 1,000 companies hit their growth goals. We have expertise across all areas of marketing, from performance to lifecycle and SEO to social analytics and creative, just to name a few. But that is it for our sales pitch. So let's go ahead and get started. So I am so thrilled and excited to have our presenter, Katie Freeberg. She is our investor operations partner here at Right Side Up. Katie is a growth marketer with over 13 plus years of experience leading teams and building best-in-class marketing strategies. And most recently, Katie was an operating partner at TSG Consumer, where she advised their portfolio of D2C companies, including Corpara Yoga, Backcountry, and Rough Country, just to name a few. And I'll let Katie do kind of a quick bio when we get started in a few minutes. And with that, this wouldn't be a webinar without walking through our housekeeping items. So as you know, all participants except the panelists are muted. However, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And we want to keep this webinar interactive. So if you have any questions or want to pose any questions to anyone else on the webinar, feel free to use the chat box. And lastly, an email with the recording will be sent after this webinar. So if you want to rewatch it or share it with any colleagues, you're more than happy to do so. All right, that is it from me. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Katie to kick off today's webinar. Enjoy, everyone.
Thank you guys for attending. I know it's a busy time of the year, but I'm really excited to be in front of you guys. I feel really passionate about this topic, even though it tends to be one of the less glamorous topics, let's call it. So today we're going to go over, kind of the state of things going into 2025 when we talk about our introduction. We're going to talk about planning scenarios. So there's a lot of you in the audience that come from a different range of companies. Some of you are seed stage, some of you are growth, some of you are really mature companies, all the way to enterprise. And so it makes it a little bit challenging trying to cover all of those, but I'm going to try to get through that today. We're also going to talk about forecasting methodologies. This is really the specific tactics. And, my intention with this section is to give you some skills, whether it's, how to do things at the seed stage level, whether it's growth stage level. I'm hoping you guys walk away with some, hands-on keyboard skills that some of you may have, some of you may not. And then actually applying those skills to building your budget. We're going to talk about that. And then most importantly, securing buy-in. We'll talk about that, but I think that can be equally as important as getting the forecasting and the budgeting correct. And then at the end, we will have time for Q&A. That said, when I've been a participant in webinars, I like being able to chime in with questions when it's relevant to this section. So please don't be afraid to chime in. I will do my best to take a look at the Q&A. Amanda will be watching it as well. If there's anything burning, please don't be afraid to chime in. And I'll take a pause at the end of each section to look at the questions. And if there's something in there, I'll answer them real time. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Actually, we can quickly go through this. So I mentioned I want you guys to be able to budget at whatever stage your company is at. Everything we do as marketers is becoming data-driven. Scaling is also really challenging, particularly when you're trying to forecast scaling, and learning how to take those dynamics into account is really important. And then the last thing, both building and defending realistic budgets is going to be super important. So I hope you can take all of those away. The one last thing I will say before we get started is one of my favorite sayings is there's multiple ways to bake a cake. Meaning, what I'm going to give you guys today is several different frameworks of a way to approach budgeting and forecasting. That said, there's plenty of you in the audience that have probably done different tactics that have been just as effective and have worked for you. So don't take this as like, this is the only way to do it, but think about it as like a framework to help you with the stage of company you're at. So really quickly before we hop in, we're going to do this poll. What I'd love to hear from you guys is if you're doing budgeting and forecasting currently, what have you been given? I have seen all of these scenarios at different companies. In some cases, I was given a fixed budget, but I needed to figure out, what revenue I could drive. In other cases, I was given a revenue target, but needed to figure out how much spend I needed to get there. And then most often I have seen where you get a budget and a revenue target. That's where I find is like the trickiest. So I just want to hear from you guys, what you've been given. And then for those of you that have been given neither, I feel like that's really the Wild West. And quite a few have been in that place. Okay, I'm very fascinated that only 3 of you have been given both a budget and revenue target. Okay, that makes me feel better because I feel like you guys are going to learn a lot. All right. So when we think about 2025, oh, Amanda, did you want me to share the results? I realize that's on my screen. I don't know if I was supposed to share those.
No problem. Yeah, I shared the results with everyone so they're able to see it.
Amazing. Okay, great. Okay. So with that, let's hop in. Sorry, guys. Somehow I just got logged out of Google Slides. I don't understand why this happened real time. Sorry, Amanda.
You are fine. We actually still see your slides. We see the 2025 marketing context.
Oh, great. Okay. I don't know why it popped up a box that said I've been logged out. So sorry, I'm just logging back in. I'm
This is
glad
how
you
you
can't
know,
see my
guys, we're
login.
doing a real live webinar, right?
Yeah. The mistakes are the best, or not the mistakes. This is not my fault. Okay, great. So getting started, when we think about going into 2025, I mean, some of this stuff is kind of a repeat of last year, but there are some dynamics for this year. So first of all, when we think about the current economic landscape, interest rates are still high. We have tighter capital markets. It means companies really need to focus on being more efficient and focus on those proven channels while being extra thoughtful about experimental ones. Every single year we see CACs continue to rise, particularly as competition increases, which also, by the way, makes retention and customer lifetime value just increasingly critical metrics to be optimizing towards as we go into 2025. The second thing, again, digital marketing continues to evolve. This has been part of the conversation in previous years, but the continued decline of third-party data and the rise of AI-driven marketing tools, it's really reshaping, how we think about campaign effectiveness. Add on top of that, privacy changes, have increased the importance of first-party data, while also simultaneously making attribution more challenging. So, as we think about budgeting, our budgets need to be more flexible to account for measurement uncertainty. Third, customer journeys. We've, again, heard this in past years, but they are not linear, and customer decision cycles in some cases are requiring more touch points, and in other cases, they're a lot shorter. Think about people that see an Instagram ad and they buy right away, or other people that want to do a lot of research before they make that purchase. This continued shift towards omni-channel marketing just means that budgets have to account for more complex customer journeys and those cross-channel effects. And then the last one, again, we see this every year, but the major digital channels like paid social and search continue to see CPCs trend upward. The maturity of these channels really means that marketers have to plan for higher costs to achieve the same results. And that's something we're going to talk about when we look at scaling our budgets and taking into account the performance. So with that, let's hop into the different planning scenarios. So the question I asked in the poll was really related to these 3 scenarios. When you think about seed stage, early stage companies, you're often very much budget constrained. Your CEO, if you have a CFO, whoever's on the finance team, is likely coming to you and saying, hey, we've got $100K to spend for the next quarter. What can we get for this? And so you really have to think, okay, well, let's start with the spend. How am I going to, spend it amongst the different channels, and what am I going to get from that? At this stage, you are definitely focusing on the maximum efficiency. And unfortunately, you're also often operating with limited resources. We'll go into these different frameworks in the next couple of slides, but I think it's important to think about it from kind of an overview standpoint. From there, when we think about growth stage companies, if you're familiar with how Meta divvies up their teams, you might have heard of disruptors. You often see disruptors in this growth category. And this is where your CEO or CFO is going to come to you and say, hey, we've got to hit 10 million ARR by Q4. Like, what do you need to make it happen? We got to grow. This oftentimes, happens for various reasons, but, maybe you're trying to raise another round, maybe you just raised a round and you're trying to get, to that hyper growth stage. But really what this means is you're probably doing a little bit of a tops down and bottoms up approach with your budgeting. In this scenario, you're scaling channels, and then you're also defending your budget because you're kind of moving out of this early stage where you had limited budget to, maybe the finance team hasn't quite accepted that we need, as marketers, more budget to hit those targets. And then the last one, I'm calling this CFO driven bucket, but let's be frank, the other two are also driven by finance. The difference here is really where, your CFO is coming to you and saying, you got to hit 50 million in revenue. And by the way, you only have 5 million in budget. This is where I often see the largest disconnect between the marketing team and the finance team. And, you really have to spend a lot of time validating the assumptions. That's what it is. There's often just a disconnect in what we believe the assumptions are going to be. You're also trying to maintain scale while optimizing, and then again, managing the expectations of your CFO. I'm going to pause. I did see a question pop in. Do we work with many companies who focus on efficiency target where they can spend as much as they want as long as they're hitting their efficiency goal? Yep. So that is definitely this middle section, this growth bucket. Again, the revenue target might be what the finance team gives you, but it can also be the case that they're saying go spend as much as you want as long as you hit this CAC target, which is often easier said than done because oftentimes the CAC target that you're given is limited, right? So as you increase those targets, of course, you can scale, and there's this trade-off between how do you scale while, staying within your LTV and CAC restraints. So great question. It's unfortunately a tricky place to be, but we probably see this scenario most often in that growth bucket. Okay. So let's quickly talk about seed stage, because I know I did take a look at the participant list and saw quite a few seed stage companies that had signed up. When you're leading marketing here, you're typically working with a fixed budget constraint and limited historical data. I call that out because that's really important with forecasting. Having limited historical data just means you're kind of shooting in the dark with what you hope you can get. And it really creates a unique planning environment where experimentation is crucial, but every dollar has to be justified. So you have to be super thoughtful with managing that risk. In this case, you're going to start with your fixed budget, for example, the 100K per quarter, and you're going to work towards determining what those achievable outcomes are. And your goal here is really finding that most efficient path forward. As you're working with limited historical data, using industry benchmarks can be helpful. It's important to note that you're going to have small sample sizes, and so it can be really challenging to interpret results when it's hard to say, are they stat sig? Are they repeatable? So it's just important to be mindful of that. The other big thing that I see as an issue at this stage is your resource constraints, whether that is from a personnel standpoint or if it's from tools and creative resources. For those of you that have spent a good amount of time on Meta, having good creative can make or break your ability to scale. And just at the seed stage, it's really hard to work within those constraints. So, the idea is really start out by figuring out what your metrics are that, are going to be defined as success, whether that's CAC, whether that's, the number of signups you want to get. There's many different metrics you might be optimizing towards, but setting those in advance is critical. Also, you always want to document your learnings. What you learn at seed stage is going to be very different than growth, but it's important to be mindful of that because the other thing I've seen is as you switch from seed to growth, you're actually retesting some things that you tested in seed stage. Maybe they didn't work at the seed stage, but they might work at the growth stage. So it's important just to keep those documented. And then as it relates to risk management, it's hard. It's a little bit of a trade-off because at this level, your channels probably are somewhat new, and so you could call them quote unquote unproven. But that said, you do want to stick 70% of your budget. That's what we're looking at here on this right side to your core channels that are going to work for you. So in B2B, it might be LinkedIn. For B2C, it might be Meta or Google Ads. Having a 20% testing budget is ideal, and then having a 10% buffer. I've seen some scenarios where people continue to, or not continue, but like go over, and just having that buffer is nice. Going on when you're at this growth stage, this is back to the question that was asked around, do you see being able to spend while hitting CAC constraints? Like that is often in this bucket. When you think about your planning here, you're really starting from a revenue first planning perspective, because it's often, again, you're trying to grow as fast as you can. You want to segment your targets by customer type. So here you're probably getting more rigorous about breaking down by new versus returning, or, in B2B, you might be breaking down by product type or geos. Like there's a lot of different ways you might break that down. And then, once you know what you're going after, you want to start building your budget and take into account those scaling factors. From a framework standpoint, I'm going to say this, and this is one of those things that's easier said than done. And also at the growth stage, I don't know if I've seen this very often, but the guardrails that I want to mention is try not to have more than 40% in any single channel. Again, for those of you that are maybe working in this stage, what I've often seen is one channel is dominant, where it gets maybe even up to 80% of the spend. And it's really dangerous because you're putting all your eggs in one basket, and it's just hard to find wins in other channels. I've seen this a lot. So my, feedback, if you can prevent your company from getting in that position by kind of limiting to that 40%, in any single channel target, that would be ideal. Also, I put a minimum of 15% test budget. When you translate 15% to whatever your absolute numbers are, 15% might be too high. So again, there's multiple ways to bake a cake. Take what works for your company. Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 20%, but do what's best, based on those absolute numbers. The important thing here is to make sure you have testing budget. And then similar to seed stage, you want to think about your team evolution as you're growing here. So this is where your channel specialists are going to start to emerge as you scale within individual channels. You might want to get more specialists that work on those channels. Also, having an analytics team and that can help you optimize, whether it's building your budgets or think about your ad campaigns. Often it's the performance marketers running the campaigns that are analyze them, but sometimes analysts are doing that work as well. And then here, this is kind of that trade-off of, as you start to scale and spend more, you're going to see your CPCs rise and you're going to see your conversion rates decline, which we'll talk about more, but those are always to be expected. And then the last one here with the mature stage, the enterprise mature stage, whatever, however you want to call it, the focus here really shifts from growth at all costs to maintaining scale while optimizing efficiency. So here you're really carefully validating your assumptions, understanding true channel economics. You're probably understanding, cross-channel impacts, and then finding opportunities for improvement within existing channels. The one thing I will say here too, I saw this a lot at TSG, that was the private equity firm I was at before I came to Right Side Up, is, at this stage, you're often considering what is your budget as a % of revenue. And so this, going back to those planning scenarios, this is that CFO driven, they're probably giving you that 5 million budget as a % of, the revenue, because there are, kind of targets that the finance team are often going after. And that's why you might see, let's call it tighter budgets, maybe relative to where you've been. And then also, understanding how you're going to get to those revenue goals can be really challenging. So again, here, I think the biggest takeaway is, as you scale, you continue to see that marginal ROI decline. You're also going to start to see channel capacity constraints. And then, what are the limited new channel opportunities? Because at this point, you've probably started to tap into quite a few new channels, and it can be harder to find those, new quick wins, let's call it. I'm going to pause. I saw a question come in. Have you seen a trend of seed companies approaching budget planning and execution a la CFO scenarios? I've noticed that some want to learn stuff that's outside of their budget, like cross-channel influence. So not really at the seed stage. I mean, I was on a call with a company a couple weeks ago, and I heard this. It's actually a CEO. They're so small they don't even have a finance team, and he was like, "We have 20K for the next 2 months. Like, let's pick one channel and figure out if we can find wins on that one channel. And like, also tell me what we can get for 20K." And I'm telling you, it is so hard. Like, there's so little data to go off of. I don't want to say you're guessing, but you're making educated assumptions. But when you think about how cash constrained seed stage companies are, it's just much harder to have that CFO scenario where they're like, "Oh, I want, 50 million with a 5 million revenue." And the good news is most CEOs get that. They don't, they understand that you're kind of starting from zero. So hopefully that was helpful. Okay, this is a really good question. I saw another one come in. How do we stick to that 40% max for one channel target if one of the channels is significantly more efficient than the rest? Yeah, I unfortunately have seen this time and time again. It is so hard to get away from one channel that is that win. It might be Google Shopping, it might be Meta. Just because it was Erin that asked this question. To her point, like, one channel can often significantly outperform in a meaningful way the other channels, and that's the challenge. I think the key there is you have to continue testing into new channels to find those new wins, or test new tactics within those channels. So if you're finding success in Meta and not in Google, like, what are you testing? Maybe you've only run PMAX. Like, okay, well, let's switch back to standard search and standard shopping and see what we can do there. Maybe you optimize to a different event, because these conversion algorithms, like, let's be frank, I personally feel like Meta is really good at quickly, being able to ramp up, of course, depending on your spend. But compared to Google, I see Meta, being more successful in that regard. And so maybe you have to try different tactics for that channel that you're having a hard time scaling, just because the performance is the same. That's not a great answer, guys. And I'm just being realistic I'm sure all of us have been in that spot. It's just iterating, whether it's your strategy, the channels, etc. Okay, so going on, just finishing up this section on planning scenarios. What you want to think about, what's most important here is, like, how are you transitioning between these approaches? Oftentimes there is some kind of external trigger, getting your Series A funding or even Series B. That means your company has more money to hire more resources. So you're going to do maybe more sophisticated, forecasting. Also, you might be part of the reason you're raising more money is because you found success, you found a quick win within one of the channels, and you've scaled the business enough, which also means you figured out those proven channels, right? And then you start having just more historical data to reference. And so then you get to this revenue target, this growth stage, where you're building that mature business model. You've got multiple stakeholders you're working with. And then, at some point you start shifting towards an efficiency focus. And in this last bucket, success is really about having more sophisticated forecasting, your cross-channel attribution, and then just rigorous documentation of what's working and what's not. I'm going to do a very quick pause, and I'm also going to do a quick time check. We got to move faster, so I'm going to keep going. So within forecasting, there's 3 approaches that I'm recommending for you all. So the first is a really basic approach, and it's going to align to kind of that seed stage approach, where you're probably going to do something, relatively simple. You're going to use your historical averages, moving averages, your growth rate. We'll go into depth here in just a second, but it's probably really basic, and that's okay. It can actually be really powerful, even though it's still, straightforward. This middle bucket is this statistical analysis bucket where you're probably starting to, build linear regressions, which we're going to quickly talk about. You're taking into account seasonal adjustments because you start seeing the flows of the business. And then you're, following some of the trends of the business as well. And then the advanced methods, this is where we're going to talk about media mix modeling. You're going to be more sophisticated with understanding how your channels interact with each other. There might be external factors such as, increased competition. And this is really that mature, rich data, company. Of course, the most important thing is you got to have data, like to figure out which of these buckets works for you. You got to make sure you have the data to be able to support it. You also need to have the resources. You're probably not going to be building a media mix model if your spend is relatively low and you don't have a lot of historical data. Similarly, if your business isn't at a place where you could invest in one, whether it's building in-house or externally, you're just not going to move to this bucket yet. So really think about what business stage you're at, the accuracy that's needed. So that's another thing at this higher level, you probably need to be much more accurate. And that's not to say you don't need to be accurate at the seed stage level. It's probably just as important because you're super cash constrained. But it's really important to consider that and then your resources. Moving on. So let's talk really just quickly a few minutes on basic forecasting. So there's really 3 approaches you can take. One thing I would say, when I started my career a very long time ago, I would say I didn't understand, well, first of all, I wasn't that great at Excel. And I could beat that drum all day. Like if you have the ability to use Excel really well, you can just be so much more powerful with your work. The second thing is, try to understand how to calculate growth rates. Historical averages are pretty straightforward. You're just looking at the last 3 to 6 months to calculate the average and you're applying it to the future. Moving averages, you're selecting, a subset of the windows because maybe where the business was 6 months ago is different from where it was 3 months ago, maybe because the website changed, there's a new product or whatever. And so you only want to select a smaller window. And then the last one, this growth rate based, this is just period over period growth, and then applying that rate to future months or periods to see what that looks like. Going on. So this is my favorite stuff to talk about because I feel like, linear regressions, it can be scary, but I think it's actually really straightforward once you've done this a few times. And I think being able to build your own linear regressions will help you in several ways. So the first one, when we talk about forecasting, we're often forecasting revenue, but this is a time-based analysis. The other way, which we'll talk about in a few slides, is looking at your metric correlation. So as your spend increases, what happens to your clicks, what happens to your conversion rates, etc. And so, to really understand how to understand what these metrics are going to look like as you scale your spend, being able to predict that is really important. Again, you can use this basic approach with Excel. It's equally as powerful, but this is kind of taking it a step further. I'm actually going to do a real quick demo for you guys because while it sounds intimidating, I think it's really straightforward. And when, I've taught this to people in the past, they're like, oh my God, this is like an unlock for me to be able to build my own forecasts or, build out these scaling matrices. We're going to go through it. I'm not going to tell you the Excel implementation just yet. There's a couple things to keep in mind when we're thinking about the results, in addition to building the linear regression based on the data we have. You want to understand what's your R-squared value, what's your p-value, and your coefficient, which we'll talk about this in the next slide, but this is essentially, I put marginal return. This should be marginal change. Over 70% for your R-squared value is a good fit. We'll talk about that, what that means in case you don't know that. P-value less than, this is actually 0.05, which is 5%, is where you want to be. And let's get into this really quick. So for those of you, this is going to be just a really quick lesson from whether you learned this in high school or college. When we're calculating the slope to build the linear regression, the formula is y equals mx plus b. I've tried to put this in marketer terms because for me, when I understand it in marketing terms, I feel less intimidated by this and it helps me understand the inputs when I'm, doing this in Excel. So just as a reminder, Y is the value you're trying to solve for. M, this is the marginal change, which is essentially your slope. It's the coefficient. So every time you have a 1 unit change in X, how does Y change? X is your independent variable, which might be your increased spend or your next month that you're forecasting. And then B, in my head, this is my way of remembering it. I remember B is like baseline. This is the predicted value of Y when X is 0. Obviously, you're not going to have, when you have 0 clicks, or sorry, 0 spend, when you're building the linear regression, it's still going to tell you have clicks, but that is just theoretical. So if you're showing the line, like how it intercepts with when X is 0, that's what that value is. R squared, so this is just a measure of how well the regression line fits the actual data points. It ranges from 0 to 1. The most important thing you need to know is that being closer to 1 is better. That's what I said on this previous slide of like over 70, percent is ideal. It's just showing if there's a linear relationship between all of the variables. Said differently, if your R squared value is 0.8913, this means that 89% of the clicks can be explained by the level of spend. And the last one is p-value. This is your statistical significance. It basically tells us the probability that the observed relationship occurred by pure chance. So this is why you want this less than 5%. So the example I gave is, this is actually a p-value I did. We're going to see in the exercise. It means that there's less than a 0.02% likelihood that the conversions occurred by pure chance. So I'm going to flip open to Excel. And guys, I'm going to be honest, I'm like nervous doing this real time. I feel like when people watch me in Excel, I get a little nervous. Also, any questions on that? All right, so there's, again, in the spirit of there's multiple ways to bake a cake, I'm going to show you first my preferred method and then the also very simple method. I personally always like to graph my data. So this first scenario that we're looking at is if we are forecasting revenue at a monthly level. And in this example, we have 36 months. Why is this? Please hold. Okay, we got this. Great. Okay, so what we're seeing here is how, sorry guys, how is your revenue growing over time? I like to graph this. I'm a very visual person. After I graph it, I go here to trend line. I add in the linear trend line. If you select the linear trend line here, format selection, when you do this, you can display the equation on the chart and your R squared value. This is really a quick way to see this data in one view. That said, we don't have our p-value, so this is kind of limited. But what's nice is when I'm looking at this, it's a quick way to see is the data what I would expect it to be from like an R squared perspective. So Excel, again, super easy. You probably will have to install the tool pack to get data analysis, but it's really straightforward. When you go here to add-ins, this analysis tool pack up here, see, I already have it added in. Go here, add it in, and that's when you'll see this data analysis up here. So we're going to do this. We're going to pick regression. We're going to put in our data. So our Y range is going to be spend, which we got. Look at automatically put it in here. And our X range is our months. And then I am going to put this here so you guys can see the output. Oops. Sorry. I selected the wrong cell when I was choosing where I wanted it to go. Great. So when we get this, we get a bunch of information that looks, like there's a lot. But again, what we're looking for, you can see this information is the same as here in the chart. We check our R squared, it's over 70%, it's great. We're looking at our p-value here. I put these in percentages because I am not a math person. I don't understand scientific notation that well. I'm not afraid to admit it. When you like push out the decimals, you can see this is obviously far less than 5%. There we go. We finally got some. And then the two numbers that you need here is your intercept. Remember, that's the b, that's the baseline. That's, you know, where it intersects with 0. And then your slope, your marginal change. So from here, we want to forecast, let's say, the next 4 months, and we're just going to put in our formula. So you want to do the reference. So in this case, because we're doing months, so we're trying to figure out this 37th month, that's what we're going to reference. And then we're going to add our baseline. So what's interesting about this is you can see, I'm going to do this, you know, month 37 is less than the previous month. So let's go ahead and just chart this. Well, guys, where did my chart go? There it is. So let's add this data. And so what we see here, oops, I didn't do an absolute. Please hold on. This is why I like the graphs. Like, it's a good way to check your work. So these months that we projected, they're going to follow that trend line that we put in, because it's truly just taking the output of the regression model and applying it. But what we see here is actually the previous month, that 180K was actually an outlier. And so, you know, these future months are probably not going to be as high, but it is in line with the trend. So super straightforward. I'm not going to do another example. I had one teed up, but just in the interest of time, I want to keep going. But you can do the same thing with, you know, spend, clicks, etc. We'll see that example here in a second in terms of how to apply it. But again, you can build the same linear regression just with different metrics and with a different approach. I'm going to check to see if there are any questions. Great. I hope that wasn't too annoying. Like, the big thing I wanted you guys to see is that this isn't hard to, you know, take this, to be able to apply this approach. Like, Excel does all of the hard part, and I don't want anyone to get intimidated. Like, just reach out to me if you're ever like, oh, I want to do this, but I can't figure it out. I'm stuck. I'm happy to always help you. But B, like, it hopefully gives you guys the ability to just be a little more sophisticated in your approaches. Okay, so we're going to keep speeding through because we're running short on time. Sorry, guys. As you get more sophisticated, you can do this exact same approach, but in Python or, you know, some other data science tool. And really, you know, part of why you would do this is because your needs are just going to grow and be more sophisticated. And Python really offers capabilities beyond what Excel can handle. You don't have to jump to this advanced tool until your business is ready for it. But obviously, this is, you know, next step in that progression of getting more sophisticated. The big thing here is having a lot of data. Actually, even with the Excel version, you really want to have enough data, because if you have too few data points, it's going to be hard to kind of build out that model with confidence. And then the last model, this is another one I spent a lot of time on at Third Love. You know, one of the most powerful aspects of a media mix model is the flexibility for scenario planning. Once you've validated a model, you can quickly answer business questions like, if I need to hit 10 million in revenue next quarter, what's my required marketing spend by channel? Or if I have a mixed marketing budget of $1 million, what can I realistically expect? The other thing that I loved about our media mix model at Third Love is you're also able to fix, and I'm sure most vendor platforms have this functionality, but you're also able to fix spend, right? So let's say you need to hit 10 million in revenue. You've already committed, let's say 500K to TV. That spend is not going to change, but you also have to plan a scenario around that 500K. And so, you know, a media mix model allows you to do that and really take into account those trade-offs between channels and the impacts before you're actually making the budget decisions. I think the other thing about this approach is this approach really accounts for diminishing returns and, like I said, the channel interactions. So again, something else we spent a lot of time talking about at Third Love is marginal cost. So most of you are probably familiar with incrementality. Marginal cost is taking that a step further and saying, what's the cost of the next order? Because your incremental CAC or your incremental CPAs, depending on how you're looking at the numbers, might look like they're in line with the targets you would expect. But then when you look at your marginal cost, it might be quite expensive to get that next order. And what a media mix model is going to tell you is, let's push this budget into a different channel where the marginal cost isn't as high. I think that the other, important thing here is really making sure your finance team is aligned with how the media mix model operates, the inputs, the assumptions, etc. One thing I've seen in the past is that if the finance team struggles to understand how the media mix model operates, they don't necessarily buy into what the results are. So that's really important. All right, let's get into building. Again, just doing a time check. I'm going to speed through this. So there's the most important thing, if you guys take anything away from this section at all, is we really need to be building channel specific performance matrices. And I'll show you that on the next slide. We'll talk about top down and bottom up, and then really thinking about your planning foundation is, I think another most important thing is having a channel level understanding, irrespective of which approach you take. This is the gap that you're going to fill that the finance team doesn't have. So the finance team is often going to bring you, some of their assumptions, but they don't know how the channels operate at a more granular level. And they certainly don't know how the channels operate as they scale. And that's where, being a really good partner to the finance team is going to make you both successful. I'm going to quickly pause. Oh, no. Okay. I thought we had another question. All right. So, and the one last thing, especially as companies start to grow, you guys will often reforecast. It might be quarterly, it might be intra-month, depending on how performance is growing, but you always want to expect to reforecast. So this is that scale impact analysis that I talked about. So this would have been the second type of the linear regression that you could build. Let's say you've only spent up to 55K, and at 55K, your CPM is $15, you're going to get X amount of clicks, etc., right? But you want to know, if I scale to 65, 75K, what do these other metrics look like? And this is real data, by the way, but the point is, having this built out at a channel level absolutely will help you build, whether you're starting top down or bottom up. You have to fill in the gap somehow when you're building those assumptions. So step one in my mind is build this out for your channels, because it'll make your job so much easier. So when we talk about the top-down framework, the first thing, obviously, you're starting with your revenue. You want to break down to your monthly targets, account for seasonality patterns. So B2C is going to be very different from B2B. You want to segment your revenue streams. Again, this is where I talked about new versus returning customer. You might separate out new logos versus expansion revenue if you're B2B. And then this channel strategy, this is probably where you're going to spend a lot of time. You're going to look at the historical channel mix, understand which channel works best for the customer type you're trying to drive. And by the way, keep in mind, this is not we've been talking about paid, but if you're ahead of growth, you're probably thinking about paid and owned. So, when you think about that historical channel mix, it might be email is driving repeat customers, whereas, your paid is driving new. So it's important to keep that in mind. Also, then this required metrics. This is that part of having that scale matrix, understanding what are your requirements. You're kind of plugging in the inputs, and then you're getting to that required spend level. So it's okay, how many customers do we need? Okay, based on the customers, where are we getting those customers from by channel? Once we know the channel, it's okay, well, how many conversions do we need? That's the other thing at this required metrics. You're probably filling that gap, or you're building that gap between CPA and CAC, because you have some attribution model. This is where it gets really tricky, but you've got to bridge that gap between, let's call it in-platform metrics to what your finance team is looking at. So this is a really important step. And then the last thing, of course, is just calculating how much spend you need by channel. The bottom up framework. So, with this top down, we started with the revenue. The bottom up is you're often starting with either a spend amount, go back to seed stage where it's like, you've got 20K, go tell me how much we can do with it. Or you're starting with a growth target. Like, we have to grow new customers, or maybe it's all customers by X% year over year. So you start again, figure out your channel analysis. You look at your historical and current performance, figure out what percentages you think need to go by channel. And then again, you're going to bring in that scale matrix and figure out, okay, at this new level of spend, here's actually what my conversion rate's going to be, which means here's how many customers I'm actually going to drive. From there, you're building the budget to say, okay, well, if this is how many customers I'm going to get by channel, and this is what I think my CAC target is, this is how much spend I need. And then this last part, this is where you're really going to iterate. And again, this stuff is time consuming, but you really want to validate your targets, like what's feasible and what, is just ideal. So then, the other thing that's most important to take into account, which is also very hard, is you want to allocate testing budget. So you want to have testing budget both at the portfolio level and then within your specific channels. So at the portfolio level, depending on what stage your business is at, you might want to have 10 to 20% within the new channels and 10 to 20% optimizing channels that are starting to have some wins, but really 70 to 80% is in those core channels and proven tactics. And then when you're implementing it, think about how much time you need. So B2C is probably going to have a shorter testing cycle than B2C. If your B2C is, a self sign up, maybe not. But you just want to keep that in mind when you're thinking about how you're going to test. And then most importantly, setting those metrics in advance of what is defined as success. I think, your success is a couple things. Like, first, how much money are we going to spend? When you're thinking about determining if a test is successful or not, and when to stop, you really want to think about how much spend am I willing to dedicate, how much time am I willing to dedicate, and how many iterations of a particular test do I want to go after before we stop a particular test. This is so important. You guys got to, plan this stuff in advance. And then last thing, I'm going to get this in right on the wire, securing buy-in. I have found this is often the hardest part when you're working with your finance team. Again, when I said a few slides ago, like, we're the marketing experts, and so we know how our channels are going to perform just because we're in the weeds day to day. We know how scaling works. And so the most important thing, whether you're doing top down or bottom up, when you're working with the finance team, align on your assumptions. I cannot stress that enough. I have been at so many companies where, or I've worked with them when I was at TSG, where the finance team says, we're going to actually have X conversion rate, or our AOV is actually going to increase to this amount. What I encourage you to do is really push your finance team to explain what's driving those metrics. So if they assume conversion rates are going to increase, like, okay, so what are we doing to the website? What are we doing to the product that's going to drive that conversion rate increase? Also, then you as a marketer, you have to translate that to your specific channels. Are you going to see that same uplift within channels? How do you bake that into account? It might be like you're launching a new product line. It might be you've bought into a particular inventory that sold out last year. And so having more inventory of a high selling product means, you can sell through more, and maybe you're changing your shipping thresholds, right? So that would cause AOV to increase, right? So there's any number of reasons why your metrics might change, but getting your CFO/finance team to really clarify what's driving the change is so important. It also helps you as marketers to know what to expect. And then you always want to come with this data-driven defense, have your channel performance, that matrix, have that available. Those charts that you're building, if you're building linear regressions, have those available, pull those up and say, here's where I'm getting these numbers from. And then, the most important thing is being proactive. At several of my past roles, we met with finance every single week. It was like, here's what our metrics are. In some cases, it was me asking the finance team, are we scaling this week or are we getting efficiency? And based on their feedback, I would go and adjust spend accordingly. But having those shared dashboards, you're looking at the metrics weekly and then having those regular check-ins, that will set you up for success in the long run, because you're building credibility and you're just working in a good partnership and you're bringing them along for the ride. So I think it's a great way to find success. So just in summary, sorry, I'm going to take 30 seconds. Make sure you're matching your approach to the stage of your business. Ground your plans in data. We all know this. I'm guessing 99% of us live and breathe data, and then build trust through the process. Like, make your finance team a really amazing counterpart, and you guys will be successful together. Okay, so I did see a question pop in. Thank you. I appreciate the feedback. It sounds like this is a really helpful webinar. Can you provide Excel model templates for the channel performance matrices and explain a little more on how those are built out? So yes, I think what you're asking me is to kind of show this. So this is the same thing where sorry, my Zoom windows are in the way of my Excel buttons. So you're really kind of taking this exact same approach again. Again, there's multiple ways to bake a cake. I like this method because it's very easy, because I've done it so many times, right? So again, here we have this. We're going to put this out. Why is this? Oops, I did something wrong. Okay, let's see. Hold on. So the Y range is going to be how many clicks we have. And then it's how many clicks we have based at the spend level. I know I did a little test run this morning so I had populated this previously. So we're basically going to get the same thing. Again, I am a visual person. I have to graph this, and we're going to do this quickly. Oops. Okay, so great. So what this is saying is, what this is showing is how many clicks you're going to get based on your spend level. Let's add that trend line again, because I'm a little neurotic. So you can pull in this trend. Sorry, I know I'm going fast because I want to be mindful. There's no other questions coming in yet, so I'm going to do my best here to go fast, but hopefully make time for other questions. Okay, so we've got our formulas, but again, we've got that information to the right. Because I looked at this data before, I know our p-value is where we want it to be, along with our squared value. It's over 0.7. And then our p-value, again, I hate the scientific notation. Great, so we've got all of our inputs. So here, what you're going to do, and I'm going to give you a couple tips here once you're putting this into practice. So this scale here is in $100 increments. So, figure out what increments you need it to be. Maybe it's $5,000 increments, right? You're going to apply the formula. Oops, sorry, I needed to move that. So what we're doing here, so again, keep in mind, this is our marginal change. And in this case, we're saying at $1,300, what are our clicks going to be? And then of course we're adding in that baseline. In this case, it's 700 clicks. Oops, I still forgot to do absolutes. Right. So now we start to see, how our clicks are going to grow as we scale. Let's pop this into our chart. So it looks a little wonky because we start to see the curve. This is also actually a good example of why I graph things, because if I saw this, I would be really skeptical. I feel like you're starting to hit that point of diminishing returns. And so to me, this doesn't feel attainable. And by the way, I didn't talk about this, but one thing I often do is I'll take haircuts. So if I think, we're starting to see the point of diminishing returns, what I might start to do is let's put in our period over period growth, or our growth at the different spend levels. Actually, let's just see, this seems wonky, right? We have this outlier of 19%. And this is largely because our earlier, the rate at which we were growing earlier was quite steep, but then in these more recent periods, it really starts to taper off. And this is a great example of where I would adjust the inputs of this regression model I mean, you probably don't want to adjust it to 4 data points because it's not enough. Your p-values are probably gonna maybe go outside that 5% range. But at this point, I'd probably start taking haircuts and make my own adjustments. The other thing I would note as you do this, your spend level is probably most of the time, again, multiple ways to bake a cake, is what you want to be as your independent variable. So that's the thing you always want to reference this to. So maybe the next metric that you want to build out is, let's call it conversions. So drop in your historical data. You're like, okay, what does it look like when I start to scale? Your conversions, I would probably actually do it both ways. You could build this with your clicks, because we all know as your clicks increase, your conversions are gonna, your conversion rate's gonna decline. But it's also relative to spend as well. And since this is the metric that you're trying to say, like, what's gonna happen as I increase spend, you probably want to build your regression models in reference to your spend. But again, this is where you want to spend some time, graph things, see what it looks like, and take haircuts where you need to. Use some of those basic, the historical averages, the moving averages, etc., to really refine your model. Sarah, I hope I answered your question. If I didn't, you can also email me afterwards, and I would be more than happy to give you, any more specific information. Actually, the same goes to all of you. My email address is going to be here in a second on the next slide. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to reach out. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yes.
Anything else?
I was gonna say, I don't think any other questions have come in. However, if you do have any pressing questions, Katie's information is up on the screen right now. So feel free to reach out to her, or you could put in your questions real quickly in the Q&A box, and we'll review them after the webinar, and we'll address them individually. But before we wrap up, we just want to get your feedback on how this webinar performed. So we're throwing out a quick poll question. So just rate how you thought the webinar went from a scale of 1 to 10. And while you're filling that out, just wanted to let everyone know our first webinar of 2025 will take place on a Wednesday, January 15th. We have a great group of panelists from across Right Side Up and Reddit. They're going to be kind of talking through the 4 New Year's resolutions for growth marketers to embrace in 2025. So you can grab your phone and scan that QR code on your screen, but we'll also include a link to that webinar in our follow-up email that will go out tomorrow as well. I know I got a bunch of questions in the chat and Q&A about the recording. So yes, we will be sending a link to the recording tomorrow afternoon. We typically will send it out around noon East or noon Central Time. So look out for that in your inbox. And with that, I think we're wrapping up today's webinar. So thank you so much, Katie, for walking through everything. I feel like we almost need like video snippets of all those Excel examples. I'm sure all the marketers on this call would definitely appreciate that. And thank you everyone again for joining this webinar. Ooh, I think we just got a question about the QR code. So yep, it's up on the screen now. So feel free to scan it. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining again. Thank you, Katie. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Bye.